Tonight we begin with a decision that Washington insiders had feared, denied, and buried in bureaucratic language for months. A move that unfolded not over years of open debate, but in a single legislative session. A session that stripped millions of retired Americans of benefits they spent decades earning. A session that left seniors scrambling to understand why their monthly checks were suddenly smaller. A session that Washington hoped would pass without anyone noticing, and almost did. What Congress did this week crossed a line that advocates for America's elderly had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, senior rights organizations, retired workers, and outraged citizens did not hesitate. They responded with fury, with legal challenges, and with a demand for answers that Washington is now struggling to contain. For months now, there had been signals, not official announcements, not formal policy papers, just quiet signals, that certain factions within Congress were preparing something that most Americans would never approve of if asked directly. Congress has been gridlocked, yes, but they have been remarkably unified in their silence around Social Security reform. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, a choreography, almost a script. But what set off alarm bells among senior advocates and policy watchdogs this spring was that the usual public debate went completely silent. Policy analysts who monitor federal budget negotiations know the warning signs. The disappearance of public hearings on entitlement programs, the sudden consolidation of budget language into unrelated bills, the quiet meetings between fiscal hawks and appropriations committee chairs, the sudden removal of Social Security line items from publicly accessible budget summaries. All of that went quiet. And whenever Washington goes quiet on Social Security, it means something is about to happen that they do not want seniors to see coming. Social Security isn't just a program. For 67 million Americans, it is the difference between dignity and poverty. It is the check that pays the rent, covers the medication, and keeps the heat on in January. And Congress knows that. Which is exactly why they did what they did in the dark. Early this week, budget analysts and investigative reporters detected what they described as a sweeping set of embedded provisions within a broader fiscal package, including benefit calculation adjustments that had not been altered in over 3 decades. These are the kinds of legislative maneuvers that certain members of Congress only deploy when they are signaling something very specific. A quiet reduction in future payments, a structural change to eligibility thresholds, or a reweighting of the cost of living adjustment formula that determines how much your check grows each year. Watchdog groups didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that Congress was changing the architecture of Social Security benefits. And when a legislative body shifts the structure of a program affecting tens of millions of people without open floor debate, even by a seemingly small measure, every senior in America should pay attention. Here is what was buried inside the legislation. First, changes to the COLA, the cost of living adjustment. That determines how Social Security payments are increased to keep up with inflation. The new formula uses a different inflation index, one that historically produces lower adjustment numbers. What does that mean for you? It means your check will grow more slowly than the actual cost of your groceries, your prescriptions, and your utilities. Second, adjustments to the primary insurance amount calculation, the formula used to determine your base Social Security benefit based on your lifetime earnings. Subtle changes to this formula can reduce what a retiring worker receives by hundreds of dollars per month over the course of their retirement. Third, and perhaps most alarming, provisions affecting the age and income thresholds that determine benefit eligibility for certain categories of recipients, including some disabled seniors who rely on Social Security disability insurance as their only source of income. The response issued by senior advocacy organizations this week was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was not a press release. It was urgent, coordinated, and backed by legal resources that these organizations have been preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Analyst after analyst described Congress's move as deliberately obscured, structurally consequential, and perhaps most importantly, designed to be irreversible once the budget window closes, but political maneuvering only works if the public hesitates. America's seniors did not. In fact, The grassroots response over the past 72 hours has been among the most rapid and organized we have seen around a Social Security issue in recent memory. Here is what we know. Within hours of the provisions being identified and publicized, AARP issued a formal statement condemning the changes and demanding a full congressional explanation. These weren't casual policy complaints. These were formal legal and legislative challenges, coordinated efforts that senior advocacy groups only launch when they are preparing to fight something all the way to the floor of Congress and, if necessary, into federal court. Calls flooded congressional offices, town hall requests were submitted, petitions circulated, and for the first time in years, the phrase "cuts to Social Security" trended nationally, forcing the story out of the shadows where Washington had hoped to keep it. Tonight, investigative sources confirmed that the provisions embedded in this legislation affect retirees in several direct and measurable ways, including changes to benefit categories that had recently been reclassified in ways that analysts believe were specifically designed to reduce long-term federal obligations. Let us be specific. Let us name what was hit. They changed the inflation measurement tool. Instead of using the CPIW, the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners, the new formula shifts toward the so-called chained CPI, a measurement that assumes consumers substitute cheaper goods when prices rise. The problem? Seniors don't substitute. When your blood pressure medication costs more, you don't switch to a cheaper version. You pay more. The chain CPI ignores that reality and produces smaller annual increases to your benefit check. They adjusted the earnings averaging formula. Social Security calculates your benefit based on your highest 35 years of earnings. Quiet modifications to how those earnings are indexed mean that workers with gaps in their employment history, disproportionately women, caregivers, and those who worked in lower wage industries, will see their calculated benefits reduced. They restructured certain disability thresholds. Seniors receiving SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance, face new review timelines and income offset calculations that could reduce or eliminate benefits for those who attempt any part-time work to supplement their income. In other words, Congress targeted the very mechanisms that protect the most vulnerable recipients, the foundational calculations that make Social Security a reliable promise rather than a fluctuating gamble. This is what made Watchdog's warnings so urgent. These weren't cosmetic changes. They were structural. They were the kinds of changes that compound over time, that cost individual seniors tens of thousands of dollars over the course of their retirement, quietly, invisibly, without a single news conference to announce what was done. And here is where the story becomes even more troubling. Policy researchers now believe that Congress's latest move was designed to test the awareness of the American public during a period of political distraction, when attention was focused elsewhere and the legislative calendar was crowded with higher-profile debates. Certain members of Congress wanted to see whether the public would notice, whether seniors would catch what had been slipped into a 1,000-page budget bill, whether advocacy organizations were watching closely enough to raise the alarm before the window to challenge the legislation closed. But instead, the opposite happened. Watchdog groups didn't look away. They flagged the provisions with a speed and precision that was so thorough, so publicly documented, that even the bill's architects were caught off guard. You don't easily force a congressional backtrack. But this week, the pressure came close. Analysts speaking with major outlets under anonymity described the legislative strategy as salami slicing, a technique of making cuts so incremental and so obscured within broader legislation that no single piece seems dramatic enough to trigger a public outcry, even though the cumulative effect is devastating. But senior advocates proved this week that they remain both vigilant and organized. Their response was not only fast, it was documented so precisely that specific provisions were identified by page number, by subsection, by the exact dollar impact on different categories of recipients. That level of detail matters because it shows that seniors and the organizations that represent them are not passive recipients of whatever Washington decides. They are active participants in the defense of a program they paid into for their entire working lives. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scope of what had been embedded in this legislation. Senior advocacy organizations in all 50 states mobilized constituent contact campaigns forcing congressional offices into a position of having to respond publicly to a story they had hoped would remain technical and invisible. Legal analysts identified specific provisions that may conflict with existing Social Security statutes, opening a pathway to judicial challenge if Congress does not act to revise the language. Former Social Security Administration officials, speaking publicly for the first time in years, stated that the changes to the COLA formula alone could cost the average retiree between $1,400 and $2,300 per year in lost purchasing power within a decade, money that will not be recovered. This wasn't just a budget adjustment. This wasn't just accounting. This was a transfer of financial burden away from federal coffers and onto the backs of America's elderly. This was a policy decision that will be felt every single month by people who have no other source of income and no ability to go back to work and earn more. And that is the one thing that makes this different from ordinary legislative maneuvering. These are not abstract numbers. These are real people, real checks, real consequences for real lives. Remember, those who have long sought to reduce Social Security outlays thought the program was too politically untouchable to reform openly. They thought the only path forward was through quiet, technical, embedded changes that wouldn't trigger the kind of response a direct cut would provoke. They thought that with enough legislative camouflage, this could be accomplished without a political cost. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. The story is out, the provisions have been named, the dollar amounts have been calculated, and the American public, particularly the 67 million people who receive Social Security, now knows exactly what was attempted and who voted for it. This is not the first time such an attempt has been made. In 2013, a chained CPI proposal was floated and ultimately abandoned after public backlash. In 2017, budget frameworks included structural Social Security changes that were quietly removed after advocacy pressure. Each time, Washington learned that Social Security is not a program Americans will allow to be quietly dismantled, and each time, some within Congress convinced themselves that the next attempt would be more successful. Tonight, that assumption is being tested again. What makes this moment so significant and so dangerous is that Congress's latest move happened at a time when the federal budget debate is under enormous competing pressures. Fiscal conservatives want deep reductions in entitlement spending to address long-term deficit projections. Defense appropriations advocates want to protect and expand military spending. Infrastructure and domestic program supporters want to preserve investment in roads, broadband, and social services. Healthcare lobbyists are simultaneously pushing for changes to Medicare and Medicaid that intersect directly with Social Security recipient populations. And the Social Security Trust Fund itself faces a long-term solvency challenge that will require serious policy attention by the early 2030s. Congress is attempting to balance all of these demands while navigating an election cycle in which Social Security is, as always, one of the most politically sensitive topics on the table. And when legislators in that position make sudden, obscured moves, they are not doing it from a position of policy confidence. They are doing it from budgetary pressure. They are doing it from the vulnerability of knowing that an honest public conversation about these trade-offs would not produce the outcome they are engineering behind closed doors. Seniors deserve that honest conversation. They have earned that respect. The formal objections now circulating through congressional and advocacy channels are designed to signal that America's seniors and the organizations representing them are not willing to allow quiet legislative maneuvering to erode a program that has been the bedrock of retirement security for nearly a century. Senior advocates said plainly that Congress's embedded provisions were inconsistent with the fundamental promise of Social Security as an earned benefit. That is measured language for, you tried to cut our benefits without telling us, and we are not going to let that stand. You don't usually hear that tone from organizations that typically work through careful, measured policy engagement, unless something serious is at stake. And make no mistake, the financial security of 67 million Americans is about as serious as it gets. Meanwhile, retirees across the country address the situation in their own words, in letters, in town halls, in calls to congressional offices, in terms that were plain, direct, and impossible to dismiss. They said, I worked for 40 years and paid into this system every single paycheck. You do not get to change the rules now. They said, I am 81 years old and my Social Security check is the only income I have. Every dollar you take from that check is a dollar I cannot spend on food or medicine. And they said, "We are watching, we know what you did, and we vote." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a generation of Americans that understands exactly how high the stakes have become. And that has the political mobilization history to back up every word. Here is what makes the situation even more concerning. These provisions were not isolated. They were part of a broader pattern of budget decisions that, taken together, represent a systematic shifting of financial risk onto individuals and away from federal programs that were designed to absorb that risk. Alongside the Social Security changes, Medicare reimbursement rates face proposed reductions that would affect which providers are willing to accept Medicare patients. Medicaid eligibility rules face tightening that would affect low-income seniors in long-term care facilities. Prescription drug assistance programs face funding reductions that would increase out-of-pocket costs for seniors managing chronic conditions. All of this happened within the same legislative package. When multiple programs serving the same vulnerable population are altered simultaneously within a single budget bill, it is not a coincidence. It is a strategy. Policy analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Congress, facing overwhelming public pressure, agrees to strip the most damaging provisions from the final budget package before it moves to a floor vote. Another is that the provisions pass as written, triggering a wave of legal challenges that could delay implementation for months or years while the cases work through federal courts. A third possibility, the one worrying senior advocates the most, is that the provisions pass quietly. Implementation begins before most recipients notice the change in their monthly deposits. And by the time the full impact is understood, the political window to reverse the damage has closed. But today, informed and mobilized seniors are working to take that third option off the table entirely. They are not waiting. They are not hoping someone else will handle it. They are calling, writing, organizing, and demanding accountability with the urgency that this moment demands. What we are watching now is a test of democratic accountability. Congress wants to see whether financial decisions affecting the elderly can be made without triggering sufficient public awareness to create political consequences. Seniors want to demonstrate that no such decision can be hidden, that the people most affected by these changes are also the most engaged voters in the American electorate. Advocacy organizations want to prevent a precedent that would make future cuts easier to accomplish through the same legislative camouflage technique. And the broader public needs to understand that what happens to Social Security today will determine what kind of retirement security is available to every working American in the decades ahead. Tonight, we have heard from policy and legal experts who are closely monitoring this situation. They say the next 2 to 3 weeks represent the critical window during which public pressure can still influence the final shape of this legislation. They say congressional offices are already receiving significantly higher than normal constituent contact volume on this issue, which means your call, your letter, your voice matters right now. And they say that Congress's decision to embed these changes in a broader package rather than introduce them as standalone legislation reveals an awareness that these cuts cannot survive open public scrutiny. Seniors are not retreating. In fact, seniors and their advocates are pressing harder than ever. Their response this week, informed, organized, and loudly public, sent a message to Congress that you cannot quietly restructure a program that 67 million Americans depend on without being held accountable. And it sent a message to every working American that the Social Security system they are paying into today requires active defense, not someday, but right now. As the legislative calendar moves forward, we expect more details to emerge about the full scope of what is embedded in this budget package. But what we do know is that the public exposure of these provisions was timely. It created the political conditions necessary for a genuine debate. It empowered seniors and their advocates with the specific information needed to challenge these changes through every available channel. And it demonstrated that legislative transparency is not optional when the financial security of tens of millions of Americans is on the line. What happens next will depend on how sustained the public pressure remains. If Congress reverses course and removes the most damaging provisions, this moment will be remembered as proof that an informed and organized public can protect Social Security even against quiet legislative attack. If they do not reverse course, advocacy organizations have already shown they are prepared to pursue every available legal and political remedy. And tonight, for the first time in this budget cycle, the architects of these quiet provisions appear to be uncertain. The legislative calendar is still moving. The provisions are still in the package, but the silence they counted on has been broken. And when Washington's quiet maneuvers are exposed to full public light, it means seniors are paying attention. It means they are organized. It means they are preparing their response carefully. Because tonight, certain members of Congress were reminded of something they seem to forget every few years. Social Security is not a line item. It is a promise. 67 million Americans are watching what you do with that promise. And those 67 million Americans vote. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The cuts were found. The provisions were named. And the seniors of this country have made their position unmistakable. They did not earn this benefit to have it quietly taken away. They will not accept that quietly, and they will not forget who tried. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this fight unfolds.